Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia. In this episode of Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts, we look into a story of romance, a Romeo and Juliet story in the Australian Goldfields. The story of the Goldfields began way back on February 12th in 1851, when the first discovery of flecks of gold were found in a waterhole near Bathurst in New South Wales. Shortly after this, there was people looking for gold everywhere and in different states. With the finding of gold brought others searching for the same. People from different states were coming over to where the goldfields were now being set up, and also people from many other countries were learning of the Australian goldfields and coming to see if they could get lucky themselves. This particular story takes us to North Queensland, or far North Queensland, where a William Hann first found the indications of gold in the Palmer River area. This brought such a rush to Queensland and to the top end. People came from everywhere trying to find gold, and it brought about a story that we'll get to a little bit later. William Hann named the Palmer River after the Premier of Queensland of the time, Arthur Hunter Palmer. Once it was established as a gold-rich area, many people rushed to the river in the hope of changing their lives. This rush, of course, meant that the first people of this area were about to have their lives changed too. On one of the expeditions, where there were 110 diggers, police and officials, came through and shot away any first people that came into their way. This could have been men, women and children. Anyone that would get into the way of their dreams of finding gold. In the time of this gold rush, we found that there were many Europeans that came in from different parts and settled into the area that was a camp at first, known as Palmerville, but it steadily grew into a town. More diggers from different states of Australia came, as well as the Europeans, and then eventually people from China. The Chinese miners brought their whole families in some cases. Some of them were backed by wealthy businessmen back home in China to start big dig operations. It is known that roughly between 1874 and 1877, over 20,000 Chinese miners and immigrants arrived into the Palmer River area. Little towns started popping up everywhere around the river. Maytown, that wasn't that far from Palmerville, and another town known as Limestone. Many Europeans would find gold quickly on the surface, and instead of deep digging, they'd move on to a fresh site in hopes of finding gold quickly. When new gold popped up at Hodgkinson River, many of the European diggers moved over quickly in search of fresh gold and fresh places to dig. The Chinese miners settled in at Palmerville, taking up where the Europeans left off. They figured that there was already gold there, why move to another area? And they stayed there, building little houses for themselves, called joss houses, which were small houses with a slanting roof. They believed that if anything evil got on top of their roof, it'd slide right off. They also had gardens, vegetable gardens, and were able to get their own water source from nearby dams. It was a real community effort for the Chinese people. They worked together. They weren't seen very nicely in the eyes of the Europeans or the other diggers, as well as the first people. Well, the first people didn't like any of them. Their little haven area was now being dug up, and there was thousands of people swarming over where their homes were. They were being driven out, and many of them would come and attack the diggers, and the diggers would fight back. It is not known exactly how many perished in the warfare, but it would have been a lot. Not only were the first people fighting with the diggers, but the diggers were fighting amongst themselves. Primarily, the diggers didn't like the Chinese miners. At many times, the Europeans would try pushing them out of the area. It didn't work, and they gave up eventually. The Chinese were so many, so they really couldn't be moved. Now, there were people in Cooktown, which was one of the major ports that was bringing in boats from other countries. The people from Cooktown, not all of them, but some racist people, one day met some Chinese miners who'd just come off the boat onto land. They rounded them up and they abused them, cutting off their ponytails that sat high up on their heads. They didn't like them because they were different. They dressed differently, they acted differently, they ate differently and spoke differently. Whereas the Europeans, some of them knew English, and they dressed very similar to the people here. The Europeans weren't seen that differently, but the Chinese were. And this meant over the years that they were here, they were treated very badly, not just at the Palmer River, but everywhere. The goldfields were worked for many years until, for the most part, the gold was no longer being found. The men were starving, were forced to leave the fields and the lives they knew behind. Towns where there had been tens of thousands were now almost empty. Shops closed and whole towns were simply abandoned. Even family members who died during the height of the goldfields in the cemeteries that were set up in these towns had to be left behind. When there was no more gold, there was no more town, and they disappeared. But that's not all that happened in the goldfields. We know that in many abandoned places all over the world, there are spirits that have been left behind. Some who had been murdered, others who met tragic ends. And the goldfields had their share of these. Amongst the wars between the races and simply others who killed people for the gold that they had, left a darkness behind that encompasses these old abandoned towns. Maybe not all of them, but I'd say in most there'd be a couple of ghosts that you may run into if you visit. And here's a story about a couple. We'll call them Romeo and Juliet, as time has not left us their names. We find that in the late 70s, there are many multicultural families. Some of the families that came to Australia in the hopes of gold had kids, and those kids met other kids of different nationalities. And before long, we had people of different nationalities integrating with each other. Although there was still a lot of racism and many people still disliked the Chinese. Romeo was a 19-year-old boy, father Chinese and mother Anglo-Saxon. Juliet was a 16-year-old girl, father Spanish and mother a member of the First People. Despite them both coming from multicultural backgrounds, their parents hadn't accepted everybody, including each other. Romeo and Juliet were very fond of each other, but the parents would not have it and forbade them to marry each other. They did what most star-crossed lovers would do. They fled together. Now, shortly after they left, they were noticed absent by their parents. Juliet's father notified police and had Romeo charged for abduction. The police set out after them, not knowing the full story. Luckily for Romeo and Juliet, they were able to make a bit of ground. Juliet had stolen a bag of flour from her father's shop, and they survived by making damper, and living off anything that they could find in the bush. They made their way south in the hopes of coming across Palmer River, which was at the time a bustling goldfield. They hoped to find gold for themselves at some point and be able to live together free. They ended up travelling 100 kilometres south into the abandoned Goldfield town of Limestone. There they found many abandoned houses or huts, as well as a hotel with one room in it, and a tiny Chinese joss house. But having been abandoned and not maintained, the little town started getting overgrown with weeds and vines, kind of resembling a little jungle. But they wandered into the joss house. There was yellow and red paint peeling from the walls. The boy kicked something that looked like an urn, about the size of a teacup. He knew what it was for, but he kicked it anyway. It was possible after their long journey they were tired and irritable, and upon the urn crashing to the ground and opening up, ash started coming from the urn. They decided to leave the joss house, but on the way out noticed that there was an orange tree. They grabbed some oranges from the tree. They found a hut to lay down in together. There was a bit of commotion at one point from outside. At first they thought the police had caught up with them, but then they looked through a window ever so carefully and quietly, and along galloped a couple of prospectors. Rowdy and loud, they found the hotel and started going through the hotel noisily looking for alcohol. They must have found some as they were beginning to get quite drunk. After a couple of hours of drinking, looting and general noisy behaviour, the men jumped on their horses and left town. There wasn't much for anyone to really stick around for. Most of the looting had already been done. After the commotion of the prospectors had finished and they were long gone, Romeo and Juliet ate their oranges and decided to get a bit of well-earned sleep that they may not have had for some time. During the night, Romeo was awakened by a feeling. He sat up in the bed and looked around, and he noticed in the doorway was a Chinaman. He could see the outline of his ponytail up high on his head and his gaunt features. The man seemed to motion to Romeo to follow him. But Romeo, knowing at once that it was a ghost, is fearful and cannot move. Finally, he gets the courage to put his head under the pillow and wish the man away. The ghost vanished, and Romeo woke Juliet up right away and told her what had happened. She tried to convince him that he'd been dreaming the whole thing and went back to sleep. However, for Romeo, he was quite shaken and couldn't get back to sleep. He sat up and spent the night until dawn, watching in the doorway until the sun came up and he felt safer. They spent the day moseying around and decided to stay another night, as reluctant as Romeo was. They were able to get a little bit of shut-eye before, around midnight, the ghost turned up again, bathed in a glowing, unearthly light. Romeo noticed the ghost and woke Juliet up right away. In fright, she clung on to him. They were sat there watching the ghost, with the ghost watching them. They could see his eyes were sunken in and a yellow light shining from the eye sockets, but they could not see the pupil of the eye. The ghost started beckoning them to come with him, as he'd done with Romeo the previous night. The couple hung on to each other as they decided to follow the man. As they followed him, they noticed he was dressed in the Chinese miner's outfit. They wondered what had happened to the man and why he was here. The ghost kept looking over its shoulder to make sure they were following. When it reached the Joss house, the ghost entered and asked them to follow. The bright light that surrounded the ghost lit up the whole building, and the smell of the incense that they had smelt earlier was now very strong. The ghost seemed to be moving around as if trying to find something. It even seemed to be a little bit stressed out. Finally, it stopped at the overturned urn, the one that Romeo had kicked over. He rose off the ground and sort of hovered over the urn, and then he looked back at the young couple. He looked at them with a kind of scowling face, as if he knew that Romeo had kicked over and smashed his urn, but then his face grew sad, as if remembering how he died. The light seemed to fade from the man, and his body seemed to droop. It was like the life had just been drained from him upon remembering his death. Juliet must have felt some kind of connection to the ghost because she felt inside the ghost's pain. She reached out her hand toward it, offering comfort, but the ghost drew back. For a moment it seemed to linger with one final glance at the couple, and then it disappeared. The light went from the room, and the Joss house became totally dark. The couple didn't know what to do. It was all over now, and they couldn't understand what the ghost was trying to tell them. They went back to the safety of their hut and jammed the door shut, blocking it from anything getting in. They sat on the bed for the rest of the night, clinging to each other once again, trying to comfort each other with words and hugs, until the light came in. The sun rose, and they felt comfortable to leave the hut. They were going to leave Limestone altogether, but they decided, or curiosity got the better of them, that they were going to go back into the Joss house. Now that it was sunny, they could have a little look around and try and work out what on earth the ghost was trying to tell them, and why he was so sad. Inside, they went back to the urn that the ghost was hovering over. He couldn't understand. It was just an urn full of ashes. Was the ghost upset that he'd died? He read the engraving on the side, knowing some of the Chinese characters. It read, "Within this humble vessel lie the ashes of a son of the celestial kingdom, Fen Cheng Lu." Juliet said to Romeo to put the urn down and that they would be on their way. But the boy was perplexed. He didn't know what it all meant. Why did Mr. Fenn's ghost come to them? And he'd scared Romeo in front of Juliet. No, he was mad. He wanted to know what was going on. He upended the urn and all the ash came out. There was a little bit of wind that came through and it blew the ash into his face. Instinctively he drops the urn, which hit the ground hard with a loud crash and broke into pieces. Romeo and Juliet stared at the ground as the urn had cracked open and shattered into many different pieces. It had a false bottom on it, and among the broken bits of pottery, a fortune in sovereigns and small gold nuggets lay shining in the sunlight. Perhaps this was what the ghost was trying to get them to see. He had a fortune in his urn that would just sit there forever unless the couple took it. They did. They got the gold sovereign and the nuggets and took it with them. Now, unfortunately for Romeo and Juliet, the police managed to catch up with them. They were taken back to Cooktown and their families. Luckily for Romeo, he had a lot of people vouch for his character, and the whole thing was a misunderstanding. They were questioned about the gold, and the townspeople learned of the story of the Chinese miner's ghost. Apparently, there were newspapers that printed this story as far as New York and Shanghai. However, I couldn't seem to find the story at all, and wasn't able to get any of the names or the date in which this happened. Perhaps it is just a legend, but it is a really good story. It is not known whether Romeo and Juliet ended up married and living a nice life together. It would be nice to think of this. And as for the gold, I'm pretty certain it was taken from them by the police. I wonder what happened to that gold. And perhaps that Chinese ghost may be haunting whoever ended up with it. This was just one of many ghost stories on the Goldfields. The first people have a legend about some kind of monster or possible ghost or apparition, which they would call Quinkans. Now, a Quinkan takes on a humanoid shape although their forms are stretched and elongated to unnatural proportions. It is also believed at the time of the Goldfields, the stories of Quinkans had gotten around. There were a couple of Chinese miners that it is assumed were affected by these Quinkans. One of them actually mentions it. A particularly frightening Quinkan is believed to have been responsible for the death of a Chinese prospector and for sending another miner insane. The first Chinese miner was named Lin, and he had said he'd been in his camp when the Quinkan appeared before him. It stared at him with dead eyes, and his dog had apparently run off in fear. It is believed that he tried to fight the ghost, but was not able to grab onto it. The next morning after this had happened, he spoke to a neighbour of his, a European man, in broken English. "Me solemn dog gone. I'm dog come back all a same pickaninny. Me say to ghost, you frighten dog, but you no frighten me." And when he tried to attack the ghost, all of them smoke. 3 days later, Arlene was dead. The first people in the area believed it was a Quinkan getting revenge. For what exactly, it is not known. And why did they pick Arlene? Another man attempted to murder a family of Europeans at Maytown. He was restrained before he could get to them, but when questioned later by police, he kept muttering about the Quinkan with the dead eyes. Another man by the name of Alf Munn had been out of town and had recently come back. He'd been known as one of the last of the old prospectors. He had had a ghostly encounter that he spoke about. One night he passed by an Aboriginal woman walking alone down the track. He recognised the woman and greeted her as they passed, but the woman didn't reply. Moments later, he heard something going on behind him in the town. When he turned around, he noticed that everybody in the town was running from the woman that he'd just passed. Why would they do such a thing? They knew the woman too. Alf later found out that the woman had passed away that morning. And another ghostly story we find happened to another Chinese miner. His name was Ki. He was working a claim on Granite Creek and living beside an elderly Chinese man who was suffering from leprosy. Ki kind of looked after the old man by helping out where he could and cooking meals. He was trying to do anything he could to make the man's life bearable in his old age, until the man died. On advice from the authorities, because the man had had leprosy, they urged Ki to burn all of the man's possessions. But it seems Ki had some trouble with this. He enlisted the help of his friend Willie Hip Wah. They found themselves in a kind of spiritual warfare. It seems that the old man didn't want his hut burned. The couple attempted to burn down the man's hut, but efforts were being made beyond the grave to stop them. Things were flying around, up in the air, being hurled at them as they were trying to burn the hut. A couple of bottles and cups and things hit Ki, and twice Willie Hip Wah was strangled by blankets that seemed to wrap around his throat, choking him. Ki ran out and tried to get help from other people. A couple of European miners nearby scoffed at him and said that they would come to this hut and sort out this ghost. When they came in, their horses took fright. Lamps were smashed around at their feet and fires began popping up spontaneously all over Ki's hut. All they could do was stand and watch. All of the huts, except for Ki's fowl house, which must have been a little bit away from the main houses, went up in flames. Ki's hut was gone, and the fowl house stood for another 20 years. The miners heard Ki state, well, no matter, I burn him, he burn me. At least he had a good sense of humour about the whole thing. It is not known what happened to Archie, but Willie Hipwa was the last survivor of the story and ended up a cook at the Cairns Hotel. It is quite interesting that these stories made it out. It makes you wonder, how many more stories are there? And now that these places are abandoned, what still resides in these goldfields? It's definitely something that Mitch and I want to thoroughly investigate. So don't be surprised if in future episodes there's a Goldfields ghost story we've got to tell from a first-hand account. We hope you enjoyed these stories about the Goldfields. There are so many more stories. And in time, we're definitely going to check out a lot of these mines, not just gold mines, but there are other mines around Australia that definitely need investigating. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and hit that notification bell so you're aware when we're posting more stories.
Oh well, some people learn faster than others.